unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. The discourse in India today on the issue of the Muslim community seems to swing between two contrary positions. According to the Hindu nationalist narrative, Muslims are a monolithic religious category whose presence justifies the need for greater Hindu solidarity. On the other hand, you have the narrative offered by many liberals who claim to protect Muslims as a religious minority to defend Indian democracy. A new book by the scholar Hilal Ahmed, A Brief History of the Present, Muslims in New India, departs from these one-dimensional notions of Muslim identity. It applies concepts from political science, from history, political theory, to provide a much more nuanced view of India's Muslim community. Hilal is an associate professor at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, where he is also associated with the Lokniti Programme for Comparative Democracy. He's an authority on political Islam, electoral behavior, and Indian democracy. I am pleased to welcome him to the show for the very first time. Hilal, congratulations on the book, and thanks for coming to the show.
Thank you very much, Milan, and thank you very much for inviting me on this platform and the kind words you just spoke about the book. Thank you.
Well, we have been in touch about this book for some time, and so I had the pleasure of reading an advanced copy. But I wanted to have you on because this book addresses, I think, one of the biggest questions out there when it comes to Indian democracy, and does so both in a personal as well as a scholarly way. And I thought, maybe just to get the conversation started, I want to ask you about the title. The title is A Brief History of the Present, Muslims in New India. And in the opening chapter, you write that this idea of history of the present is a kind of provocative title, right? Especially when it's employed in relation to Muslims in India. Tell me a little bit about what inspired the title and what reaction did you hope to provoke?
In last 10 years, we have been hearing the term called historic moment, historic event, etc. so many times. So the first thing was that, if it is historic, then why should you start with writing the history of the present? Because after all, everybody's talking about that this is historic in positive way. Say, for instance, Mr. Modi. And the opponent of Mr. Modi would also say that this is happening for the first time. So if this is happening for the first time and making a history, as a political scientist, this is my duty to respond to that. And obviously, in my view, the work of a political scientist to look at here and now and try to theorize it in a way that it should provide some kind of an understanding to the moment in which we live, at least the political world in which we live. So that was the first, provocation for me. But there was a deeper meaning of that as well. Because, the second part of the question was that how do I relate it to Muslims of India? Because Muslims are always seen in relation to the past, both in positive sense as well as in the negative sense. And we use past and history quite interchangeably, thinking that past and history are basically the same thing. But I make a conceptual distinction between past and history. History is only one mode to understand the past. Past is a very big phenomenon. So therefore, I thought that it would be sensible to distinguish between past and history and try to approach the past, which is traveling with us, and try to make sense of it in relation to another very interesting concept that is given to us by this regime that came up in 2014, and that is called New India. So I thought that writing, and we all know that Foucault used this in a very interesting way, history of the present. So, I am not using the way Foucault used, but I think it would be more sensible for people, especially who belong to political science, to look at this, how past travels with us, and how, when we call this historic moment, how should we engage with that and produce some kind of an explanation of things which are very, very contemporary. So in a way, when I say history of the present, I'm very much located in the idea of contemporary, while making its interconnection not merely with the immediate history, but the long processes that actually led to this moment in which we live.
So, in the book, you reflect on your own identity, Hilal, as a Muslim and as a scholar and as a political analyst. And at various points, you say that you've been criticized, including by fellow Muslims, for being, quote, passive, inactive, self-contented, armchair, liberal, secular intellectual who would not dare speak as a quote unquote Muslim. I mean, these are pretty strong words.
Yeah.
But in the book, you have this interesting discourse where you say, look, it's important to separate out one's identity from one's analysis. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that, because I imagine it must be very difficult given the highly charged, contentious, and emotive times we live in, particularly for those who live in India.
Absolutely. Basically the question was that whether it is, how can one, identities are, an individual's identity is not one-dimensional. We all have our identity attributes. And my professional identity as a researcher is equally important as my Muslim identity. But at the same time, I always, because I work on Muslim communities, so it is very important for me to underline my own self. And for that purpose, I can also, I can't say that, and which is an easy way, that I can say that I am not a political person, rather I am just an intellectual. But this intellectual political binary is equally problematic. So the term which I have used in order to find out a solution to this problem in my book, it's called intellectual politics. And in my view, there are basically three things which, as an intellectual and as a Muslim, I am doing in this book, that I'm actually highlighting that this intellectual politics has got three dimensions. One, because I am Muslim and I'm working on Muslim communities, so it is very important for me to actually keep a principled distance from the communities I work on, so that I can not merely see the making of these communities, but also to critically look at their engagement with the larger political processes. The second aspect of this intellectual politics is that I should, as a researcher, make my research more transparent and more open to my readers, so that they can also draw their meanings. And, I am taking this point from Urdu and Hindi literature of 19th century, when the author would first of all tell about himself or herself to make the reader aware that what is the process of writing the book. So that is also a political act, in my view, which is an intellect which has an intellectual angle to it. And finally, I am also making a point that my arguments are actually quite tentative in the sense that, whatever material I have collected, and I am making some kind of an explanation of that material, so that my argument are tentative and open to multiple interpretation, as well as I'm not saying that I have found the final truth. And this is something which I take it from Gandhi, because he would always say that I would like to emphasize my here and now and my moral position. So therefore, these three things, principled distance, transparency of my research, and tentativeness of my argument, these are actually political act. And I think that as a researcher, this is the intellectual politics I'm involved in. So my identity as a researcher and my identity as a Muslim, do not make me uncomfortable when I do intellectual politics of this kind.
So, one of the things you do in the book, Hilal, is you make a crucial distinction between two different concepts. The first is called substantive Muslimness, and the other is called discourse Muslimness. And substantive Muslimness refers to the ways in which Muslim identity is formed in a variety of regional and local contexts. And then on the other hand, you have something you call discourse Muslimness, which refers to Muslims' classification as a religious minority in purely statistical terms, right? Help us understand, in your mind, the difference between these two ideas, and how do they interact, if they do interact?
Yeah. Great question. Thank you very much for asking this, because this is something which is, and I'm very glad that one of the reviewers actually picked this up. And both of these reviewers were very, they thought that as if that I have resolved the dilemma they have been facing for some time. Let me just make 2 points here. One is that this is an analytical distinction, and this analytical distinction is very useful to make sense of contemporary Muslimness. Because on the one hand, when a Muslim tend to define himself or herself in his or her immediate context, it constitutes Muslimness in a substantive way. For example, if a Tamil Muslim would be talking about his or her environment in the context of Chennai, obviously he or she is referring to the immediate context. But at the same time, when he or she would start talking about the impact of Hindutva on Muslim community, the perception changed, and he or she would be actually drawing resources from the dominant discourses which are surrounded there. So there is a dialectical relationship between these two, substantive Muslimness and discourse of Muslimness. And this dialectical relationship always determine Muslim responses in a variety of ways at every time. And I was a bit uncomfortable with, say, for instance, scholarly work on this question, particularly of Imtiaz Ahmed. Imtiaz Ahmed, he was deeply interested in the idea of Muslim diversity. But whenever he encounters questions such as what should Muslim do, etc., and what is Muslim mind, etc., he would tend to, ignore the diversity question. So T.N. Madan also, found that quite problematic. And he proposes a very interesting hierarchical model to understand Muslim identity. And he says that actually Muslim identity, or like any identity, functions like a pendulum. So on the one extreme end, you have, conception of which are very diversified, which are very local. And on the other hand of this, on the other axis of this pendulum, there is a discourse of Muslimness where Muslims are defined as a global religious community. So this pendulum moves like this, and it is very important to actually understand that at what point of time we are going to look at which Muslim community and analyzing its responses to political processes. And that's why, coming back to the first question which you asked, the idea of present, the history of the present, I think that makes the dialectical relationship between substantive Muslimness and discourse of Muslimness very relevant, because only if we focus on a particular historical moment, we would be able to capture the identity which is constituted at that very moment. And that's why, the intellectual politics I just underlined, the tentativeness of my argument or the explanation inextricably linked to this process.
One of the things that you make a point of, Hilal, and I think this is pretty obvious from the ongoing discourse in India, is, whenever we read about, hear about, speak about Muslims, Muslim identity, their place in this new India, it's never discussed without reference to hindutva. But hindutva itself has a very loose definition, right? I mean, even those within the BJP, within the broader Sangh Parivar ecosystem, don't always agree on what it means. As you engage in this, what framework do you use for trying to understand and explain what hindutva means to others?
This is a great question, and thank you very much for asking it, because first of all, there are two meanings of Hindutva in post-2014 India, and this is something which is very important to understand. So the moment you start talking about Hindutva, people tend to go back to 1923, when V.D. Savarkar wrote that famous text. But that's actually an old text. This text has nothing to do with the way in which Hindutva is understood, both politically and in our social and cultural life. And that is the reason why, for me, the lectures delivered by Mohan Bhagwat in 2017-2018 were more important than the text written by Savarkar in 1923.
And I should just point out for our listeners who may not know, where Mohan Bhagwat here is, of course, the chief of the RSS.
Absolutely, yeah. So Hindutva, and Mohan Bhagwat tried, then this is also very important that there is a very interesting division of labor. BJP tend to ignore Hindutva, and if I am correct that Mr. Modi has used the term Hindutva only once in a public speech in last 10 years. And it shows, and in that very speech, he also said that I am not an authority to define what Hindutva is. So therefore, there is an intentional unclarity that is there, which is always evoked to make this concept of Hindutva more ambiguous and more uncertain, so that it can be asserted as one of the most important expression of Indian identity. So that is one meaning of Hindutva in which that is coming to us. And that's a dominant meaning of Hindutva at the moment. But there is another meaning in which Hindutva has become accepted in our cultural life, especially after the construction of Ram Temple, and even before that. Now, if you think of a person who is actually going to Ram Temple, and there are a huge number of people, huge number of Hindus, for them, the most important reference point to make sense of religion is actually defined through the prism of Hindutva. So therefore, that constitute a very interesting tussle. On the one hand, Hindutva has become a synonym of, say, Hinduism. But on the other hand, the political unclarity in which it is used actually create a confusion in the mind of those who would like to use Hindutva in a positive sense. So this is a conflict between two meanings of Hindutva. What our friends, especially those who are the opponent of BJP, could not understand that BJP, and not merely BJP, but the entire Sangh Parivar, is not interested in defining what Hindutva is, because the moment they define Hindutva in real political terms, it would become very difficult for them to actually create a space for those who define Hindutva in pure cultural, spiritual terms. So that conflict between politics and spirituality is actually going to be a very serious challenge for Hindutva politics in future.
Trying to understand Asia is like piecing together a giant jigsaw puzzle. 40 countries and more than 2,000 languages. Asia is home to some of the fastest growing economies, and it can be incredibly hard to cover this part of the world. So we're starting the Big Take Asia, a weekly news podcast from Bloomberg. I'm Wan Ha. I've been covering Asian news for more than a decade at Bloomberg. Listen to Big Take Asia wherever you get your podcasts.
You know, I want to ask you about a term that has come up a couple of times and that I use myself, although, again, it's a term that doesn't have a strict definition, which is this issue of New India, right?
Oh, yes.
The chapter 2 of your book is titled, What is New in New India? And what you go on to say is that New India is an ideological political doctrine, and Hindutva constitutionalism is a mechanism to help achieve it. And I wonder if you could just separate out these two things. How do we understand the interrelationship between what is New India on the one hand and Hindutva constitutionalism, which is something different? How do we understand those two together?
Yeah, thanks. Because, this is an extension of the question which I have just answered, the Hindutva question. First of all, New India. As I said in the book, that there are two meanings of New India. First of all, it is a policy discourse. And because it's a policy discourse, so it is actually used by the state, which has come up, say, for instance, after 2014, in two senses. First, to reconstitute the relationship between political life and the economic life of the people. Second is, it is also aimed at reconstituting or restructuring the relationship between politics and culture. And especially the political mechanism through culture is interpreted. So in first sense, when it is used to restructure the relationship between political life and economic life, and that's why I have also used the term called charitable state. Now, this charitable state is the outcome of New India, where the relationship between politics and economy is redefined. So the state is saying, in order to create New India, the state is saying that we have to make a distinction between market-oriented economic life of Indian people, where market will regulate itself. But the role of the state is only to empower citizens so that they can compete in the market. So New India in that sense is inextricably linked to this idea where the state is saying that we know that market will create certain problems for you. In order to equip you or empower you, we would provide you some schemes so that certain kind of, you will be able to compete with the market forces, and you will then create your space in it. So therefore, we are going to provide you some welfare schemes, and that's the charity model. So New India has got a state which I called charitable state, in which is reconstitution of political life and the economy in a broader sense. And that's why if you go back to, there is a pledge introduced by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2017, which says that if I want to create New India, and the 9th point of that pledge is that I will be a job creator, not a job seeker. It means that in order to become a job creator, I need certain kind of support, and that support is coming from the state in one-time grants. So therefore, charitable state is actually a state which will constitute New India, constitute the economic and the relationship between politics and economy to produce New India in that realm. The second meaning is purely political meaning, that how should you restructure the constitution, which is actually an outcome of a movement. We have to remember that Indian constitution is an outcome of a national movement. So therefore, you have to, also restructure it. Now, how would you restructure it to accommodate politics and its relationship with culture? So Hindutva constitutionalism, obviously we all know that constitutionalism is a positive term, but there is also a political meaning of constitutionalism. And in that political term, Hindutva constitutionalism has got 3 features. One is that, it looks at the idea of constitution as a rule book. So there is a distinction that is more powerfully made between the principles and the ideals of the constitution and the rules and regulations and the provisions of the constitution. For Hindutva constitutionalism, the ideal of the constitution has already been achieved. What is needed is to treat this book as a divine book of some kind, so that the rule can be implemented. And that's the reason why this Hindutva constitutionalism is very much interested in the idea of duties, not rights. So that's the first feature of it. So that, again, the political sphere can be reconstituted. The second feature of Hindutva constitutionalism is that it is very much interested in the idea of minority, not majority. And that is because they would like to emphasize what can be called Hindutva victimhood narrative. And finally, and most importantly, one nation, one constitution. And that argument is used when 370 was removed from Kashmir. The Article 370 was removed from Kashmir to make it a union territory. So therefore, the point is that in order to reconstitute the political sphere, in order to achieve New India, Hindutva constitutionalism is established as a mechanism.
So, just to pick up on something you said, this issue of this idea of the charitable state, right? You talk about this at some length in the book, and you say that, this is a pro-market state. It provides benefits to citizens on a case-by-case basis. At the same time, it bargains with them in the realm of competitive electoral politics. And I'm wondering, how this concept is similar or different to what Yamini Iyer has written about of the Labarthi state, right? Where we have moved away from a rights-based framework to essentially, citizens who now who live at the what's the word? Due to the obligation of the state, right? They're at their behest, kind of. Is this a similar argument to what the one you're making?
It's in a way similar, because Yamenis, we have been co-traveler, and we have been, developing this sort of ideas together for some time and contributing to each other's understanding. In one way, I can say yes. Yamini is also interested in the idea of the phenomena called Labharthi. What is actually a slight difference between my position and Yamini's position is this, that I would like to trace the story of this charitable state from post-liberalization period. So I'm also trying to make sense of the relationship which were reconstituted after economic liberalization, say for instance in mid-90s and early 2000, and how do these reconstruction of the relationship between economy and politics produce different political narratives. So one of the narrative that came up was certainly inclusiveness, and this has something to do with the rise of hindutva in later period, because the inclusiveness narrative that emerged in early 2000, mid-90s and early 2000 was based on an assumption that everyone is excluded, especially the marginalized communities, and that somehow created an impression that there is nothing for the Hindus. And BJP was, and exactly at that time, say for instance around 2010 and 11, nationalism has made a decisive comeback. And BJP did not actually play any role in introducing nationalism. It was basically India against corruption, followed by, say for instance, Nirbhaya, etc. So for the first time, we noticed something extraordinary in Indian public life, where constitution became a tool to mobilize people. National flag became a symbol to mobilize people for political action of some kind. And that paved the way for the creation of Aam Aadmi Party in early 2010s. Now, BJP did something very interesting, because they have been, nationalism was something which was inextricably linked to their politics. So the discourse of inclusiveness, which has created a context in which every identity was publicly discussed except Hindu identity, the grand Hindu identity. And on the other hand, nationalism was making inroads. So it was actually something favorable for the BJP establishment to link these two, nationalism and the absence of Hindus. So they actually interpreted nationalism and try to present a picture that nationalism can also be defined from the perspective of Hindutva. At the same time, because the economic policies which we have been following since 1991 moved into a different phase, where it became very important for the state to roll back further. And in that context, it was inevitable for the state, the new state, to move from the right-based, which Yamini rightly argued, right-based, say for instance, Manrega kind of policies, to a new phenomena called Labharthi-oriented one-time welfare grants. So in a way, my work and Yamini's work are overlapping and contributing to each other.
I just want to pick up on one thing that you said with regards to the sort of protests and popular mobilization. In recent years, there have been many big events which are associated with this quote-unquote New India, and which might have provoked a significant Muslim political response, right? So, of course, you have the consecration of the Ram Mandir, you have the law criminalizing triple talaq, you have the abrogation of Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir. But the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens that we saw in late 2019 are distinctive, right, in terms of the collective mobilization. And I wonder if you could just pause for a second and tell us, how do we understand the factors which gave rise to this collective protest? Of course, the protest ended once the COVID-19 pandemic started, so we don't know what would have happened had the pandemic never hit. But nevertheless, the mobilization was distinctive. What drove it?
I think, first of all, as we all know, that Constitution has become a very important uh, element of our political life. So you cannot do politics at the moment in India without evoking Constitution. And the most important provision throughout the world for the minority is the protection given to minorities. So when Citizenship Amendment Act was, passed by the state, and for the first time, and this was a very interesting thing, because I have a very different reading of that act, because it was presented as if that's some kind of an anti-Muslim thing. And that's the reason why but I do not want to discuss that, because for me, Citizenship Amendment Act is an anti-refugee act, because it is nothing to do with any religious minority, etc. Because we are talking about religious minorities living in neighboring countries. And in order to become a citizen of India, you have to spend 5 years stateless. So in that sense, from the refugee point of view, it's not a very good law. But coming back to the question of protest politics. So first of all, I think we have to make it very, very clear that Muslims participate in all forms of politics, not merely the identity-related politics. And that's why the protest which actually happened after CAA protests are also important in my view. For instance, farmers' protest. Look at the participation of Western UP Muslims in farmer protest. So therefore, it is not appropriate to say that Muslims only participate when identity-related issues are ignored. But coming back to the question, what was specific about that? So it was the three things which are crucial in anti-CAA protest. First of all, it was not presented as a Muslim issue, and it was presented as a constitutional issue. So, all the women who actually sit in different parts of the country, especially in Shaheen Bagh, were raising the question and reading the preamble, saying that it is challenging the very ideals of the constitution. And so this is nothing to do with Muslim, rather it is related to everyone. So that was the one specific argument that was made, and that makes this movement, that makes this protest, not movement, very, very important. The second thing is that if you closely look at that protest, that political parties were not involved. So the Muslim protesters, in fact, especially in Shaheen Bagh, they decided not to get the banner of any political party. So it was presented as some kind of a civil society sort of a movement. And third important thing was the symbolic aspect of it. That the symbol used in anti-CAA protest were basically the figures of national movement, contribution of Muslims of post-colonial times, for instance, Havaldar Abdul Hamid, etc. So therefore, to assert the placing of Muslim identity in public life, that protest was actually not merely about that very law, and it was about to reassert Muslimness in public life that was eroded since 2014. So these were the reasons where this very act was actually seen as some kind of a reference point to address the issues of cultural marginalization of Muslim communities after 2014 and reassertion of these to reclaim a legitimate place in India's public life. So in my view, that was the overarching framework that was introduced by this very protest, not movement. I don't think that it was a movement, because it is a protest, and the failure of this protest was that it was almost, failed to mobilize common non-Muslim individuals. So, for instance, the survey which we did immediately after the CAA, during the time when Delhi elections were happening, we found that despite the fact that Aam Aadmi Party won with an overwhelming majority, the Hindu opinion on CAA was very, very, it was mixed. So it means that despite the attempt of the protester to make it an all-India phenomenon, they failed to mobilize the people who were actually living exactly in the same city.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. You know, I want to just broaden this conversation out now to talk about the broader opposition here. And I mean that specifically the political opposition. And I was really struck, Hilal, by your conclusion that the non-BJP parties have been, quote unquote, clueless about hindutva since 2014. And I just want to quote one thing you said. You say their ideological templates are out of date, and they don't have the intellectual capabilities to offer any fresh set of political ideas. Now, I certainly agree with you. I think that assessment is spot on. But I wonder how you understand the results of the 2024 Lok Sabha election in that context, right? I mean, would you say this was kind of simple anti-incumbency that was driven by boredom or fatigue? Or was this genuinely a clash of two competing visions?
Excellent question. And first of all, going back to our initial question, as I said, that I'm interested in here and now, and my arguments are tentative. So I wrote this book before, 6 months before the results came out of general election. And in the meantime, I wrote a number of different essays looking at what has really changed in 2024. We have to remember the contribution made by the Bharat Jodo Yatra. Bharat Jodo Yatra, not because it was done by Rahul Gandhi and it was Congress's initiative. It was supported by people's movement and civil society organization. So in my view, if I go back to the Lok Sabha result of 2024, I find that there were three things which emerged and which posed a very powerful challenge to Hindutva constitutionalism as well as the charitable state model. First of all, and that's why if you ask me, I would say that the Congress manifesto of 2024 was perhaps one of the most significant political documents of our times. Because for the first time in 10 years, this manifesto challenged the charitable state model. By raising the question, look at the kind of economic policies Congress promised, and it says that wealth, welfare, and job creation, employment. So I think that it is also making a point that the model that market will regulate itself is problematic, and therefore there is a need to somehow create a different economic structure in India. So that was something which was, for the first time, Congress manifesto highlighted, and it made BJP quite uncomfortable. The second thing, in my view, in 2024 was the narrative was not Hindutva, rather it was challenged by a new narrative of Nyay or justice. And that's why not merely justice or social justice politics of 1990. In my view, a new kind of politics was also, a new kind of social justice imagination was also introduced. In this case, the diversity of, say, given categories like SC, ST, OBC, etc. Were highlighted, but also the economic disparity became an important question. So this narrative of Nyay was very, very powerful. So first is the charitable state model was questioned. Second, for the first time, a new narrative was initiated by the opposition. It was not the case in 2014 and 2019. And thirdly, and most importantly, Bharat Jodo Yatras actually resensitized the grassroots, the social sphere, which has always been dominated by Hindutva forces since 2014. So therefore, the restructuring also happened during that time. Now, the failure, if I may add, that what really happened in Haryana and Maharashtra, it shows that despite the fact that the ideas are certainly coming, Means, for instance, charitable state is being questioned. A new discourse of a new narrative of Nyaya is taking new shape. And obviously, at the grassroots level, you find some churning happening. But the old organizational structure of opposition, especially Congress, has not yet changed. So precisely for that reason, these ideas has not reached to the grassroots level, and that's why BJP's Hindutva has got an advantage again at the moment. Unlike the Nyaya narrative, somehow I feel that this Nyaya narrative of Congress has not yet been fully appreciated by India bloc parties. At the same time, internally, the Congress is also not very confident about it.
So, this takes us to a very interesting place, right? Where you write in the conclusion that, there are many critics of the present BJP regime, and they make an analytical mistake sometimes in overemphasizing the 2014 election and the rise of the Modi-led BJP as a kind of inflection point in terms of the communalization of the state and public administration. That there, in fact, are many strands of continuity that predate 2014. And my own personal view is I think you're absolutely right on this. But this view is not universally embraced. I wanted to ask you, Hilal, as you step back and you reflect, what are the threads from the pre-2014 era which continue even today? What are those things that took place, gradual though they may have been, pre-2014, whose effects we're feeling even today?
First of all, as I said, that the assumption that all the marginalized communities will come together and they would behave something called in a secular manner, and they would always vote for non-BJP parties, was so high that the internal contestation and configuration of these communities were not taken into consideration. So that was already there. So, for instance, North Indian male upper caste Hindu was villain in our story. So BJP tried to appropriate that, and that continuation played a very crucial role in 2014 election and post what really happened after 2014. That's one. The second thing is that somehow opposition gave up the idea of secularism. Now, in all our surveys, we find that people still say that India cannot only belong to Hindus. Indian religious diversity must be respected. Muslims are as trustworthy as others, and things like that. These positive things are coming time and again in all our surveys which we have conducted since 2014. Now, if that is the case, then there is no narrative to sustain these emotions and to make a political argument of some kind. So there is no template. Secularism is outdated, certainly, but and it started losing its meaning when everybody started using it in pre-2014 era. So everyone was secular at that point in time. In BJP would say we are secular. In fact, we are more secular than others, and others are pseudo-secular, which a term used by L.K. Advani on a number of occasions. So therefore, that is also a continuation of some kind. And finally, and most importantly, that, this, so obviously BJP, and if I remember correctly, after 2019 election, first thing was what Mr. Modi said after winning the election. He said that no one is using the term called secularism. Now, BJP has not, imposed any ban to use the term secularism by others. So it is very important to have some kind of a template to show that you are different from BJP. So the lack of template has somehow made position narrative, and that's why I was very much interested in the Nyaya narrative that was introduced by Congress just before the 2024 election. But somehow in all the assembly elections, I did not find that Nyaya narrative is used as some kind of an assertion to make a political point. So that is the reason why I think the advantage is now on the side of BJP. But it does not mean that BJP's house is in order and BJP does not face any sort of a problem. In my view, BJP is also facing a different kind of a challenge. The challenge is that unsettling of, because Hindutva politics has an inherent unsettling nature. So that is quite understandable. But if BJP, because BJP is the most important and most powerful political force at the moment in the country, and if they would like to rule for a longer time, they have to come out with certain positive, constructive ideas. And these positive, constructive ideas are not coming out. So there is an unease. So unease between winning election and statecraft. So BJP's statecraft is certainly very poor. But BJP's track to certainly win election is very, very professional and mechanical. So there is a conflict between statecraft and electoral politics. So therefore, BJP has to make a choice.
My guest on the show this week is the scholar Hilal Ahmed. He is an associate professor at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi, and he's the author of the brand new book, A Brief History of the Present, Muslims in New India. Hilal, this was an incredible read, very thoughtful, provocative in parts. Also, one of the things we didn't get into is the use of data from your own work with CSDS Lokniti. Thanks so much for taking the time to share with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks.
Grantamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grantamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grantamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.